Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome to session 4 on the long-term impact of COVID on student learning. We have 3 presentations for you in this section, but before we get stuck in, let me just do the standard housekeeping announcements. First of all, this session is recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube. There is an option to enable live transcription should you want to do so. And during the presentations, please do ask lots of questions. Just put your questions in the chat, and if it's for a specific person, please just put their name in there, and we'll collate all those questions together. If you like somebody else's question, don't be afraid to click like and upvote it, and we'll start with the most popular questions. I hope that's all okay. Okay. Today we have 3 presentations for you and a lot more than 3 presenters presenting. We will have Farid Ahmed from Imperial and Adeel Tariq from Manchester talking to us about learning in Pakistan. We'll have Panagiotis Giannarakis, Emanuela Lotti and Daniel Cernin talking to us from Southampton about things that went on in the UK. And finally, Krafft from the USA. So this is a nice, truly international session, and thank you for that. Okay, let's keep to time. Could I ask our first 2 presenters, so we've got Farid Ahmed, who will then hand over, I believe, to Adeel Tariq, to kick us with our first presentation on the impact of COVID-19 on teaching and learning quantitative and statistical methods. Are you guys ready to share your screens?
Yep. Just give me
awesome. A second. I'll give you 2.
Are people able to view my screen now?
I can see the whole thing, not the... There, good to go.
Yeah, is that better?
Perfect.
All right, I'll kick off then. So first to begin by thanking CTaLE for giving us this opportunity of sharing our somewhat preliminary results of our study looking at the impact of COVID on retention in particular in teaching and learning quantitative and statistical methods in economics. I'm Farid Ahmed from Imperial. I'll begin by giving you some background and motivation, explain what the study is like, explain the context, and then my colleague will share some of the results that we have so far. Okay. Right. So like everyone, we had to teach online as soon as COVID materialized within Pakistan and of course wherever we were teaching. So our experiences per se are not confined to Pakistan. Both Adeel and I have taught at various different places at different audiences around the world, but this was a new experience for everyone. And we soon realized that students are going to learn and engage in a very different way, depending on whether they were learning online or compared to the usual person-to-person mode of teaching that we have. And in fact, like Beryl et al. Mentioned in their paper that 97% of institutions relied on faculty with no prior experience. Both Adeel and I had been interested in understanding how the teaching and learning of econometrics in particular was evolving. And this incidence of COVID-19 in particular gave us the opportunity of understanding how disruptions like COVID are going to have an even bigger impact on the learning of econometrics within an economics degree. So very often, especially when the pandemic first hit, a lot of us had to amend our course outline, so we were not able to achieve our learning outcomes, and we had to skip quite a few of the topics, etc. And in subsequent iterations, people will have evolved their course outlines, amended them, and it more often than not may have meant that either the learning outcomes change or the learning outcomes will not be met. And of course, this would have been true for any subject, right? Whether you were teaching micro or macro. We are interested primarily in understanding how the understanding of statistics and econometrics is affected by the pandemic. So what we let me just highlight a bit of the literature in this field. So most of this is not specific to COVID, but it's looking at online versus in-person teaching within econometrics, and there are mixed outcomes. So like Lockman and Shermer, Ryan and Bernard think that online learning has improved outcomes, whereas Adams and Powers think that it has had a negative impact, particularly with regards to attendance, and grades have been lower. And then more recently, using their experience during COVID, Billen and Metros and Harris report increasing difficulties with online assessments during COVID. And of course, this literature is growing every day. So just to outline the context of our study and our methodology, we conducted this experiment at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. All of the students who study economics have to take some kind of a quantitative module. Usually the module that most students take is called Statistics and Data Analysis. But students have an option to take probability and statistics separately as well through other schools. But if you want to study econometrics, you have to have some background in statistics and data analysis. So we wanted to understand how well students retain that knowledge when they started their econometrics course. So students will self-select when to take that econometrics course when they were comfortable, but every economic student will need to take it at some point in order to graduate. So we use the fact that some students will have had taken the statistics and data analysis module under while COVID was still there and the pandemic restrictions were still there. And there are other students who will have had a more face-to-face mode of learning. So there was this differential that we thought we would utilize, and hence the experiment was being hosted at LUMS. So we prepared an assessment which was given to all students when they were just starting their econometrics module. And we wouldn't tell them that the assessment was for a particular purpose. We would market that as a gauge of their attention. And then we would, of course, when we went through the assessment and we marked it, we would feed that back to their lecturer and they could adapt their module as and when they wanted. We also obtained some preliminary opinions on what they thought about their own learning of statistics and econometrics, and most of them had very negative experiences if they had studied online. Most of them categorically stated that they didn't like studying statistics during in an online setting rather. And the outcome, of course, that our main differential is the mark on the assessment for students who studied these prerequisite modules online versus in person. A bit of this I've already mentioned. The assessment was presented like an unannounced quiz. Students were not prepared for it. Students did not know about it. The assessment had 6 questions. It was 40 minutes long, and the questions were mostly relatively basic. So things like calculation of covariances and means, and more often than not, we were guiding them towards it. So they would be able to answer it if they had faith and they continued attempting it. And the assessment was conducted under sort of exam conditions, but students were free to leave otherwise. By blind marking, I primarily mean that students were not aware of why the experiment was being conducted. And it was not marked by us. We prepared the assessment, so we only thought that it would be appropriate that it was marked by our RAs. We provided them solutions, and they marked both the cohorts. So this was held first in fall of 2023. And most of those students we expected would have had the prerequisite courses in an online setting. And then we ran the assessment again in spring 2023, where we think that most of the students will have taken the prerequisite modules in person. So I'm going to hand over to Adeel now, who will share some of our preliminary results. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Farid. So let me just share my screen. It's just easier to navigate slides if you're sharing them on your own. Okay. So I'm just going to show you the composition of the cohort we had. In terms of GPA, overall, the average GPA was around 3.2 of the students we assessed. You can look at the distribution on the left. In terms of how students scored in the assessment in the 2 cohorts that we assessed in fall and spring, the distribution was pretty similar. Students in spring on average scored slightly lower, but in terms of the distribution, it was fairly similar. So questions 1 and 5 were on hypothesis testing. 2 and 4 were on basic statistics and distribution theory. 3 and 6 were on regression analysis. 3 was empirical, a completely applied question. Question 6 was more algebraic and theory-based, just basically the derivation of the least squares estimator. And you can just see that in terms of comparing the two batches, it's not clear if one performed better than the other. So they were pretty similar. But if you look at the difference between scores, how students performed in this assessment, students who took the STA course online versus those who took it in person, you can see clearly for each question, the students who took it in person fared much better. So you can look at just the average mark by question on the left and the distribution of the scores per question on the right. And just looking at some of the summary statistics of the total is the total score in our intervention tool, the assessment that students scored in, and GPA is just overall GPA. So the total marks for the maximum marks for the assessment were 60. So you can see that students generally scored pretty low. The average score for in-person students was 9.3. The average score for online students who took STA online was half of that. So there is a significant difference in terms of because our prior is that GPA is the single biggest driver of how students would perform in this assessment. So the GPA distribution is very similar between the two groups. The main thing is that you can see that the number of students who took STA in person was fairly small. So only 15 students took STA in person in the two cohorts, which is one of the reasons why we've branded this as a work in progress. We're going to repeat this experiment in the upcoming fall semester at LUMS. Yeah, that my timer just went off. But yeah, in terms of just the performance of students, there is a noticeable market difference in assessment scores. Just looking, because since STA is also a core course, it's taught by different instructors, and we do want to control for instructor effect. So this is just summary statistics looking at how students performed in terms of their assessment score across different instructors. So we've anonymized names. Non-STA instructors are essentially those who did not take STA, but were from other schools, the business school or the engineering school, and they took probability and statistics courses. So you can see that there are some differences there, but you can't really compare them, too much, because it just seems like one instructor had taught most students in our cohorts. In terms of differences in student scores by gender, it does appear, just looking at the basic stats, that male students perform slightly better. But once we control for all of this, so these are our main preliminary regression results. So once we control for GPA, for gender, for instructor, and for cohort, it appears that none of these other things are statistically significant. So the difference that you just saw between male and female students in how they performed in our assessment is not statistically significant. As the same goes for the instructors or the cohort mostly. The single biggest drivers are essentially GPA and the mode of learning. So we're seeing that there is a highly statistically significant effect of teaching, of learning the prerequisite for econometrics online. So students who did that fared much, much worse. So I'm just going to end this by carving out the path for the future. So as I mentioned, our goal now is to obtain additional data on relevant characteristics. So one thing which we need to control for is the grade in prior relevant courses. Another important thing is the gap between the assessment that they took and the time that they took STA in. So we would expect that maybe students who who gave this assessment in fall would have a larger gap because of the summer, and maybe some students in spring wouldn't have that much of a gap. And since we're essentially looking at retention, that's an important factor. So as Farid mentioned, and as I just said, we are planning on repeating this in in the start of the fall semester in September, where 3 sections of econometrics are being taught at LUM. So we should have a significant number of students now who would have taken STA in person. So once we have that data, we hope to essentially update these results, and maybe we will find that the statistically significant results that we're finding in terms of online versus in person will still stand up after we have more students. So I'm just going to end this here. Thank you very much, all of you, for attending. And yeah, we'd like to welcome questions and any feedback, any comments that you might have on our design, on our results.
Brilliant. Thank you, Adeel. Thank you, Farid. Even if you joined towards the end there, I think this paper is going to have a second round, if I'm correct in saying that. You're going to run some more tests. So any questions you have or suggestions, I think would be really welcome in the chat.
Yeah.
Just put them in the chat and we'll collect them together and then ask them to the panel at the end of all the presentations. Brilliant. Okay. Thank you very much. Next presentation, going to change the running order slightly. Caroline's kind of going to go next for us, discussing, I think, DataFest, which sounds very exciting, all the way from the USA. So Caroline, are you ready?
Yes, let me just share my screen.
Fantastic.
And hopefully we're good on the screen share.
All good.
Perfect. Wonderful. So thank you for this opportunity to talk, I think, in a very relevant panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion about our DataFest event. So I'm going to tell you about DataFest. I'm going to tell you about a little bit of research we've done sort of pre-post on DataFest. And this is some work with my collaborators at St. Kate, St. Catherine University, and the Minnesota Center for Diversity and Economics with Dr. Christine West and Louise Ba. So we're very much thinking about these same challenges. This grew out of COVID-19 times, and our university was online. So how can we engage students, build community, and create relevance in econometrics courses during those online COVID-19 times? So this DataFest event began as an innovation. We tried to innovate in response to COVID, despite all the challenges. To try to retain, we had a very good class-based, community-engaged learning experience. And we wanted to figure out, how do we do this kind of engagement, this relevance during online times? And it started in COVID-19 times, but we've since continued it back in person because the students really enjoyed it. So you'll see pictures. Sometimes they're pictures of students on Zoom from the online times. Sometimes we're wearing masks back in person, all these different modalities. So it was really inspired by some of the hackathon style events and community engaged learning. And so like the American Statistical Association has these DataFest models that we were very much inspired by. And also the literature showing that big data applied to social issues is really an effective way to recruit underrepresented students to economics. There's nice evidence on that. So the research question we'll be talking about here is, we'll tell you about DataFest and then ask, does DataFest increase interest and confidence in econometrics and statistical coding? So what exactly is DataFest here? We have worked with a community partner, and we have a community work and learning office that helps facilitate that. So we worked with a few different community partners, like the Ramsey County Economic Development Office, the Center for Indian Country Development. So there's someone we're reporting back to, which I think is really interesting for the students to have both that accountability and the feeling that what the work they're doing is actually relevant to the real world and to stakeholders. So the model for DataFest is 2 events within the term, in the sort of late afternoon, evening events, Friday afternoons, 3:30 to 7:30. And we try to make these very fun events. There's dinner, there are games, we did, statistics, charades, all those sorts of things. There's t-shirts, mugs, stickers, swag. So we try to make it really fun. We have one early in the semester, so within the first month of class, and then we have one towards the end of the semester within the last month of class. So they're kind of building up a little bit over time. And there's the reporting back to the community partner, a field trip, as it were, online in COVID times, or in person as things got a little more back in person, to report back to the community partner. So you'll see some fun pictures of that. So how it works is this is required for 2 of our classes, one economics and one statistics class typically, and we open it up to other folks as an extra credit opportunity usually. And the presentation and field trip are required for one class, so you have that core group that'll be presenting, but open to others. And how the Data Fest works while we're there in those few hours is we group the students into groups of about 3 to 5 who have mixed prior experience. You have some people who are totally new to coding, some people who've actually taken quite a few classes, some people who are in their first kind of coding econometrics class and are learning as they go. And we group a little bit on software, R versus data, so people can be helping each other with the same software. And have a lot of kickoff and orientation and fun activities together, like statistic charades there, and then a lot of work time in the small group. So people are helping each other. It's very much a collaborative vibe. And at the end of each night, they present a few slides about their findings. So for the first event, a few summary statistics. Maybe for the second event, they're presenting a little more advanced regression work. And it's really a whole growth mindset and collaborative framing. I don't know how to do this yet. Look how much you've learned in just a few hours. So we're trying to frame it to really build confidence. So what we did in terms of the research piece here about DataFest was to collect some student survey data. And I'll be talking about 2 years, 2021, which was an online times, and 2022 of pre-post data. So we have about 161 observations here, but students could participate in multiple years, right? These are our majors, oftentimes taking different econometrics and statistics courses. So we have 35 unique students with both pre-post observations, and then they were sometimes observed multiple times. And we just have a very simple survey conducted using Google Forms. You can see some examples on the side of the screen there. We collected demographics, prior experience with statistical software, and then most of the survey was these Likert scale questions from agree to disagree, 5-point scale, about attitudes towards data. You know, I like using statistical software to analyze data. I feel confident, these kinds of things. So that's the data we'll be talking about as the data about DataFest, as it were. Who participates in DataFest? There are a few things that are unique to our institutional setting. We're a women's college, so almost all women students participate, and a pretty diverse student body. 45% of the participants identify as racial ethnic minorities, and that's increased slightly over time. We have commonly majors in data science, economics, and public policy participating. And we've seen somewhat more other double majors and other disciplines like public health joining in over time. The event mostly reaches juniors and seniors, but over time we've had slightly more first years and sophomores as well, which is exciting to see folks starting earlier. And there are a lot of repeat data festers because they enjoy it and are excited to come back next year. So in terms of the research I'll be presenting, I'm just going to be presenting pretty simple like pre-post comparisons with 10% significance levels and then confidence intervals, 90% confidence intervals. We know this isn't causal, the treatment's confounded with being in a course for the semester and progression, and we have no control group, but we'll still say some suggestive results from what we find. So I'll present sort of descriptively some just paired t-tests comparing those attitudinal questions. There's 17 different attitudinal questions, and then we made a factor compiling them all together from the first pre we see of someone to the last post we see of someone. So they might have some more in between. And then in our fixed effects regressions, we have individual fixed effects, so controlling for that individual level. And we also control for the first versus second data fest in the semester, 2022 versus 2021. And we're really interested in the pre versus post difference. So that coefficient, that beta 1 on our post is what we're really interested in. And we have an additional model with a minority interaction where we're looking at whether pre to post, there are any differential effects for minority identifying students. So you'll see those as well. So just in terms of some of our results here, the t-tests that were statistically significant, so I only graphed the significant ones. So remember there are 18 paired t-tests, the 17 items in the factor, and the factor is on a different scale. It's normalized where the attitudes are on a 5-point scale. So there were 5 that had statistically significant changes, and the changes were really focused on coding, statistical software, and analysis improvement. So we didn't see big changes in things like, oh, I want to be a data scientist as a career, but that makes sense. We're seeing changes in the things the event really focused on: coding skills, confidence, code understanding and analysis skills, and liking of statistical software improved. And the overall factor increased as well. So that's exciting to see those results. And then in our fixed effects models, here we're just showing the coefficients and 90% confidence intervals for the significant results, controlling for the year and the first versus second data fest, and 6 had statistically significant changes from pre to post. In terms of attitudes, the largest coefficient was on confidence, which we're really excited about to see because we really do try to make this a confidence building event, followed by understanding data and code. Those are pretty similar items. Liking using statistical software to analyze data also increased, although not as much. And there was a little increase too in thinking data analysis was a useful framework for tackling issues they cared about, which really I think reflects the community partner piece. And then the factor showed a 0.37 standard deviation increase. So we're seeing, increases over pre to post that are promising. In terms of the fixed effect models with interactions with minority student identity, we had this sort of secondary research question because there's some interesting literature on these kind of models maybe being more effective for underrepresented students. So we asked, did DataFest particularly benefit racial ethnic minority students? And only 2 out of 18 interactions were significant, which mostly means there's similar effects for these groups. Interestingly, they were kind of going in somewhat different directions. Frustration increased more for minority students, but so did the sense they could learn the software. So there's this interesting dynamic, those of you who've taught with econometrics software, right? Students sometimes get frustrated, but then they learn more. So that's a kind of interesting dynamic to think about. So I'll just end with a few conclusions and thoughts about where this research is going to. We do have another year of data, so we're going to try to add that to the analyses and then have a working paper drafted. And we want to do some additional controls and heterogeneity analyses, for example, by baseline skills or confidence, particularly to see if there are any interesting patterns there. But just in terms of our key takeaways, although we know we don't have the strongest identification strategy, we do see from pre to post that the students who participated in DataFest really increased those things that we were particularly targeting, their liking, their confidence, their understanding of using statistical software for data analysis. And it's really a model for confidence and skill building from coding in community with community engagement. They have the community of students they're working with, we're running around helping them, and the community partner. And so it's a great model, I think, for building confidence and skills from that approach. And we do see similar growth for minority and white students. Minority students were more frustrated but learned more, which is interesting. And it's really great to see this was a COVID-19 innovation, a little bit out of desperation. How do we do this online? But it persists in the curriculum, and there's some other interesting innovations that have followed that same path. So it's an interesting model for how to do community engaged learning in a really collaborative, fun environment and build that econometrics confidence. So thank you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Caroline. I'm going to slightly abuse my position here. Caroline, in the middle of that, about the 3rd or 4th slide, there's a picture with the students with their hands in the air and somebody on the floor. What are they doing in that photo? It looks fun.
Oh yes, I'll go back to that one. This is one of our econometric charades moments here. I'll try to share again so you can see this. We had econometrics charades as one of our fun activities. So we try to do fun, like we get together, partway through for dinner, and we try to do some fun things. Is it you were thinking about this?
You can see that, yeah.
Yes, I can't. This might have been. I can't remember, there was like heteroskedasticity was one of the charades, beta hat they did. They were there, you can see the students cracking up there. So that was a real hit this year, we did statistics.
That's fantastic. To conference organisers for next year, if econometric charades isn't one of the mixes, I might be quite disappointed now. That looks great. Thank you very much. Right, on to our 3rd presentation. Just a reminder, do add your questions in the chat and Caroline will pick that up along with the whole discussion after our final presentation. So Panos and Daniel, I believe you're presenting next. We can see some slides. That's good.
Yeah, it's actually, I can start. I'm here.
I don't know whether you're here as well. Sorry.
I've been the last 40 minutes trying to get in. Sorry, it's me not being technological. But I'm here finally.
That's fun. The 3 of you all joining us from the University of
change.
It's all right. All joining us from the University of Southampton. Yeah, please use the next 10 to 12 minutes to tell us everything about continuity assessment.
Thanks very much, Annika. So thanks very much, and hello everyone. Welcome to this presentation in the session dedicated to long-term impact of COVID on student learning. So what we're doing here, we are looking at the impact of a continuous assessment in the form of weekly multiple choice questionnaire. So this is a joint work and with my colleagues, Daniel and Panos, and also for a change, a joint presentation. So we're going to do 3 people in 10 minutes. So let's see the challenge. I've been given 2 minutes, so I'll try to keep with the time. So this is one thing I would like to stress. This is work in progress. We're going to present today preliminary results. This in some descriptive evidence, but this is part of a larger project, which probably you'll hear more from us on this in the future, where we look at most efficient diagnostic tests, aim at identify initial gap in different areas. Of course, here is of students. Here is, of course, analytical skill, in particular math skill. So, how, as in many other universities, COVID started and we had to modify assessment in 2021 to take into account the movement to online learning. So we will remember at the time was still online, and the need to keep students engaged. So the first thing that came into, of course, the workload, the main issue. So we take advantage of assessment, the strong assessment-driven attitude of students, and we introduce, as in many other places, university, multiple choice questionnaire in a first-year core math module. Okay, so the question we are asking are what is the most effective use of multiple choice that we're planning to ask in this project? What is the most effective use of multiple choice questionnaires? So the question formative versus summative, and then also look at the long-term impact on student learning. However, what we are presenting today, the result that we are presenting today, because of course the final exam must change over time, so we can easily compare. We are noticing, so we are presenting something else. So we are presenting the different engagement, for example, between formative and summative assessment, and my colleagues will present, and also differences that comes from the final assessment. So think of this as a all assessment strategy for the whole module when we move to on-campus assessment. I think we can move to the next slide. Thank you. So I don't have much time here to say, so there is no time to go in the literature reviews. I'm giving time to my colleagues to present the results. But of course, the question is a different way to use multiple choice questionnaire or summative or a formative. There is ample evidence that show that they increase the student engagement, different definition of student engagement. And moving to the next slide, which is the one I want to make sure I describe before leaving to my colleagues, is how the assessment is organized, has been changing in this module for the last 3 years. 2021 academic year, so the first time, when everything was still mostly online, 10 formative online tests were 10%. So students could, they needed to engage to the test, but they didn't matter how well they perform. And then there was 24-hour final examination, which was at the time online. In 21-22, something similar. There was 8 hours, but it was a final exam change from 24 hours to 8 hours, but there was the switch from formative to summative assessment. So the students had to basically get the mark, perform in the test, and that was taken into account into the final mark. This semester, same online test, 10 summative or 10%, but the main difference is now we moved to our final exam in person, and that we see would have a kind of a strong impact. So we see something in terms of learning, but in a way that we are exploring. So thanks very much. So I'll leave it now for Panos for the second part, in which I'll introduce the data. Thank you.
Hi. So as Emanuela said, we have data for the last 3 academic years at the University of Southampton in first year core module Mathematics for Economics from a Russell Group University, and we have data on marks of each online test and of the final exam. And we have also info for gender, program of study, and residence, and also completion rate of the video recording that they were provided on Blackboard. And in terms of some descriptive evidence and some descriptive statistics, in this module there are more joint honor students and more male students and UK-based students. And in terms of some results, in the last academic year, where we had a summative online test, followed by in-person exam, we find that students performed better in the online test from the previous academic years, and with the second best to be the previous academic year, where we have again summative online test followed by a take-home exam. We've also finding that the worst performance was in the first academic year, 2021, where we had formative online test followed by a take-home exam, where we observed the highest fail rates from all the other 2 years, and the lowest proportion of first. And worth mentioning that we are finding the best performance in this academic year, 22-23. Something else that we're finding is that students that are completing more than 7 online tests out of 10 are performing better in the final exam by more than 10 points from those who are completing less than 7 tests. And this difference is higher in this academic year. We're also finding a positive and highly significant correlation between the online test and the final exam across the 3 years, and higher completion rates of the online test we observe in the first and the third academic year. Yes, we're also finding that female students are performing better in the quizzes from the final exam, where males are performing better on those, and especially on in-person exams. And single honor students are performing better in both online tests and the final exams, and mixed results for UK versus international students. In terms of completion rate of the online test, more female students are completing the online test from male students, and single honor students are completing as well more from joint honor students. Single honors is BS Economics basically, and we're finding mixed results for UK versus international students. And Daniel will go more into the graphs in the rest of the presentation. Daniel, you should unmute. We cannot hear you, I guess.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm going to do a whistle-stop 3-minute tour of our quantitative statistics now. So as you can see, the students' performance across the tests went down as the academic year progressed, there's no surprise there, students' engagement will sort of tend to decrease, and that's due to the fact that there are going to be other assessments in other modules throughout the academic year, and students will focus on whatever assessment they have at that particular time, and they might not engage with something that counts for only, say, 1% of their final grade. What is remarkable here is the fact that the green bars are much larger. That's 2022/2023, and that's the year where we introduced the in-person exam. So students had a much higher incentive to actually practice as they went along and actually engage with the content, because they wouldn't be able to do the test online, so they actually had to understand the content. If we then look at the correlations between the various students' performance on the various tests and the final exam, then we sort of got a medium level of correlation, but significant all throughout, whether that, and there isn't a particular test that stands out that will be better at predicting the final performance than any of the others. Then when we look at the proportion of first, which for those viewers who are not from the UK, first is a degree that's equivalent to 70% and above in the UK. And so we took that to disentangle the students who didn't engage with the class test at all. And again, we can see that there is a noticeable difference in the final year 2022/2023, and then an obvious dip on the final exam, as this was the first time students would have done a paper exam following the pandemic. When we then look at the exam marks and the split between students who did 7 tests or more versus students who did 7 class tests or less, then there's on average about 11% difference in their final mark. So really, the level of engagement and practice does show throughout. And then lastly, if we look at the failure rate, again, we see the failure rate going up throughout the academic year. So students don't tend to spend as much time doing the online tests, and then that shows, especially on the final exam in 2022, which was an in-person exam, so they couldn't reference any of their textbooks and not. And this nicely correlates with students' completion rates for the class test. You'll notice that now we have 10 class tests, and the reason for that is we changed the content of class tests 8, 9, and 10. So we couldn't compare them across the 3 years, but for the completion rates, those are comparable across time. And you'll see that there's a slight increase for 10 for the later years, and that's due to the fact that we turn class test 10 into sort of a revision class test. So students had an incentive to go and practice the questions that are likely to turn up on the final exam. Now, if you do a split by gender, program, and residence, as Panos already mentioned, predominantly there's a higher proportion of males. We have more joint honours, and residents would have been more UK, as students from other countries had a harder time to travel to the UK because of COVID restrictions. For the test averages, when we look at the performance versus of males and females, for the first 2 years when it was online, there's not a massive difference, but there is a noticeable difference in the final year, which was in person, and that's not surprising given the literature. Say Stefania Paradis Fuentes has shown that females perform worse on timed assessments. As for the programs, we'll see that the single honours do better than joint honours, and that's because the admissions criteria for the single honours is higher than the joint honours, and that's reflected in the final exam. And then as for the residents, we do have sort of mixed results in that. And as for the conclusions, so our findings suggest that students do perform better in summative online tests if there is an incentive for them to actually complete them. For example, either including it, having an in-person final exam, or actually increasing the weight of the online test. Now, students who completed more of the online tests perform better in the final test, especially in 2022/2023 when we had an in-person exam. And then female students engage more with the class test throughout, but there are mixed results for the final exam. And as for our next steps, we are going to combine this with the data that we have from student completion rates for online recordings, which for us is a Panopto software that we use and integrate with the virtual learning environment, and then also do an empirical analysis that controls for ability via students' A-level grades and then socioeconomic status.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel, Panos, and Emanuela. Okay, as ever, Please keep adding your question into the chat, and we'll now turn to discussion across all three presentations. So if it's a particular person, please highlight who it's for. Just before I do that, to my knowledge, this is the first time we've had a big watch party joining the call. So I just think we should all give a big wave to everybody at UCL there, and they're all waving back. So let's all give them a big wave. Thank you to everyone in the room, including Parama, who I think is kindly organising all the questions for us. Fantastic. Okay, I'm going to start with a question which has sort of similar themes across the three presentations. So if I come back to Farid and Adeel, first of all, do you have any inclination of what the mechanism is that's going on behind your results? Do you have any idea what it is that's driving the in-person students to perform better?
I don't think there is one. It's could be mental health. It could be, like Caroline has highlighted, and I think someone else has highlighted in the chat as well. It could be the fact that you have a platform for collaboration when you're online or in person, and in person it's easier to collaborate. It could be specific to the university or the context in which you're teaching, or specific to the year, for example. So it's not that straightforward. Even within what we find, part of the result is being driven by the fact that everything is online, and part of that is actually specifically the disruption caused by COVID. So it's difficult to distinguish what part of our impact is online versus offline, and what part is COVID versus non-COVID. But because we're faced with the challenge that this COVID cohort is going to go, we have to capture the results as quickly as possible. So I don't know if Adeel has something to add to that.
Yeah, so I just think so there might be a way to disentangle, the effects of COVID versus the effects of online teaching, even though they overlapped for the most part. But in most places around the world, including LUMS, where I was teaching before I joined Manchester during the COVID pandemic. So for 2 years we were online. It was completely online. But the effect of COVID, in terms of, if you think of the impact of COVID, how it manifested in terms of there's restrictions that students faced in terms of their mental health. It wasn't constant, right? It was it went up and down. So there were waves when everything was shut down in Pakistan, and it was much more difficult for students to access certain learning tools than it would have been during other times. So it's just I think there is something there. There is an opportunity to disentangle those two things, but it's not easy. It just requires, I think, a larger number of students and larger cohort. But yeah, just to Farid's point, it's just I think what's clear from, I think, our results, and also looking at the other presentations, other research that we've looked at, there does appear to be an impact there, which is purely because of online teaching. And the effect of online teaching it's not homogeneous, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity there. I think somebody mentioned in the comments that there are two distinct sort of students. So some students have stayed to online learning better. Delving deeper into that, what's driving students to take up online learning better than others? I think that's also another interesting question. But there's definitely another group which is just very averse to online learning. And one more thing which I think hasn't been mentioned is also in LUMS and in a lot of other places, there was a huge uptick in academic dishonesty and cheating. And that has a huge trickle-down effect, right? Because if a student knows going into a class at the start of the semester that they can cheat their way to a good grade, I mean, that just minimizes learning a lot. It doesn't matter what you do. A lot of students, are always going to be more interested in the grade than they are in learning. It's just I think a harsh truth. It's just the way society is set up. It just rewards those GPAs and grades. So yeah, I think that's also. But yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going on and on. I like to let others speak, but yeah, it's a whole mesh of things.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I just want to pick up on the points about sort of different groups of students being affected differently as well. And Caroline, if it's all right to turn to you, I think there was also some questions there along that similar theme of how different groups might be affected differently. Do you have any idea on why sort of minority students became more frustrated? Or sort of expect me to expand further on the comments about minority students feeling more frustrated after DataFest, and can you attribute that to anything like group dynamics or any cultural issues you picked up on?
Yeah, so that's one of the things we're very interested in, want to explore a little more. I think we had been putting students in small groups sort of based on mixing ability and experience, and not necessarily thinking about any other aspects of social dynamics within small group work. And there was a great literature too for folks who were at CTaLE conference in the US about teams and diversity, and how, you know, there can be some really complex dynamics with different types of team composition and diversity and learning outcomes for students. So I feel like something like that may be at play here in terms of thinking a little more too about how to frame teamwork in part of our initial messaging, and really making sure we message sort of helping each other, and that you're all part of a team, that could be potentially helpful. We're also thinking about just messaging. So in econometrics, right, these are the first time they're doing statistical coding for a lot of the students. Just generally for all the students, messaging about frustration, and when you get that angry red message in Stata, that error code, like how do you handle it? The interesting dynamic, I think, too, is that students are more frustrated but learning more. So there may be some things going on here about, you know, you face a challenge, but you also feel like you've learned a lot. So we're definitely very curious about that. And I think thinking about some of the small group dynamics a little more intentionally going forward is something we're thinking about.
I think if you find the answer to that, we'd all be
yes,
ready and willing.
Questions, yeah.
Listen. Just before I move on to Panos, Emanuela, and Daniel, a quick reminder: if you want to ask questions on the Ed discussion board or things after this event, you can also follow up there. I mentioned that now, Caroline, because I think there's a request to, like, is there any sort of materials you can share about how to organize this event, or suggestions on where to start? That seems like that would be a good place to share. But
sure, and I'll just note, we are working on both an article on the research on the impact of DataFest, but also a learning module with the Center for Indian Country Development that was one of our partners this year. So if you're interested in that, email me. It's not ready yet, but we're hoping by the end of the summer we'll have something about like how to do this in a little more detail, instructions, examples of instructions, things like that. So email me and I'll save that email and share things when they're ready.
brilliant, thank you. Okay. I want to call you like Team Southampton, but Panos, Emanuela, and Daniel, could you tell us a little bit more about sort of the online assessments and how you dealt with any issues of academic integrity? Could students cooperate whilst they answered the questions? Were they randomized? Could you just give us a little bit more detail on that? I think that follows on nicely from Adeel's comment earlier.
Thanks, Annika, for the questions and for all the audience. In terms of academic integrity, what I forgot to mention to Douglas, we randomized the questions, and we used type of questions where the values for each student was changing randomly, so students wouldn't have the same question for each online test. And this, I think, it worked pretty well for the online tests, because basically they may have the same questions but different numbers, so they have to work out by pen and paper to give an answer. Daniel, if you want to say something more. I don't know.
I mean, the other thing I would say, along with the academic integrity as well, as there was a comment about if there were too many questions from the students or complaints. I've already put in the chat that we would get some questions from students, which is not something that isn't desired. We welcome students actually coming to us with questions because it means they've actually engaged with the online test and they've practiced and they're asking the questions as we go along rather than the day before the final exam, which is too late because they're not going to learn it overnight. In terms of the complaints, we haven't had any complaints, and part of that will be the weight. So the online tests count for 10% of the final mark. There's 10 online tests. So if you divide 10 by 10, it's 1% of their first year. So the stakes aren't that high if they miss a single test. Plus they had 2 attempts at each test. So they could go through the first time, figure out what they understood, what they didn't understand, and then they could come to us and sort of try to get help before doing the second submission. So I think the students that did engage with the online test liked it and appreciated the opportunity to actually practice and get some feedback on how they're doing.
Yes, and the good thing, we ran some feedback online feedback sessions and online feedback not quizzes, but yeah. And the students commented very positively about the online test, and they liked it. And what we also provided after the deadline was feedback for each question, instant feedback for each question, and if the students were answering wrong the question, there was a detailed explanation of why this was wrong and how they can improve. So this, I think, worked pretty well.
A very quick clarification question there for Stacey. If they could take 2 attempts, could they take it straight away, or did they have to wait before they could take the second attempt?
They could do it straight away if they wanted to. So there wasn't a wait period. They just needed to finish it before the deadline that we set them.
But still, the questions were randomized in both cases, and they could get most of the questions in terms of numbers different.
Cool. Maybe a question to you guys, and then also I think to Farid and Adeel, but Caroline, feel free to jump in if you have thoughts. What you found so far, or what you think you might find as you keep exploring these things, do you think it's really specific to, maths and stats modules, or do you think it's more generalizable to other types of economics learning, and then maybe even beyond that? Do you have any thoughts on that, any of you?
I have some thoughts on that. I do sort of I've taught from first year all the way to the top, and the pattern that I've observed in my 10 years of teaching in a variety of different places, so it's not just confined to one particular place, is a tendency among students to demand less and less quant. And as a result, not just me, a lot of my colleagues have taken away a lot of the materials that they would have covered otherwise. So every year I see econometrics losing 1 or 2 things here and there. And because of that, I think that this pressure is going to mount. I feel that way. So if, for example, you missed out, you were doing your A-levels during COVID, you wouldn't have covered as much maths as you would have otherwise. So when you first jump into your first quantitative module in the first year, you'll be overawed. You would want less, and that kind of starts the cycle where you keep demanding less and less and less quant, and your learning objectives are never met. So by the time you graduate as an economics major, the expectations of an economics major with regards to statistics and econometrics are probably not going to be met, especially what Parama is prepared in terms of what an undergraduate in economics ought to know. Those things would not be met, and I felt it particularly acutely with statistics and econometrics, because with macro, for example, the other subject that I teach, you can sort of cover it in the second year or the third year, because macro, I won't speak from micro, but for macro at least, it's mostly you keep adding more depth every year that you study. But for econometrics and statistics and maths, it's usually new materials, somewhat new materials every year, especially in the formative first 2 courses.
No, that's really valid points. Does anybody else from the other 2 presentations have any thoughts on how generalizable this is?
In our case, we have, I had a similar approach in applied economics third year, And however, we have some difficulties in the data. If we get access to the data, we will do to some data that we want. We'll do a comparison between third year applied economics and first year maths. But this is here still a work in progress.
I could add that I've taught on other, not just first year modules and second year modules, that had a class test component, and the effect of that class test was very similar to the online test. As the class test, it was, no matter where it was halfway through the semester, it was an incentive for the students to actually revise, and that sort of pushed them to engage with the content, which gives you the same level or comparable level of engagement you would with the online test, to sort of push them to actually not wait till the last minute, and serves as a bit of a wake-up call as well.
And Caroline, I don't know if it's correct to even describe what you were doing as an econometrics teaching thing. Is it econometrics, or is it actually just how to be a professional economist? So perhaps it's more general already.
Yeah, DataFest is to build econometrics and coding skills. That's definitely the goal. So I think that's how we framed it, but in a very fun, community engaged, confidence building way as you do it. We certainly, one of the outcomes we looked at was were people more likely to think about data focused careers, and there weren't significant differences on that, but we do see that confidence and skill building go up. So it's definitely people learn all sorts of new commands and data from each other, which is really fun to see what they've learned by the end of the night.
Fantastic. I'm actually going to come back and ask you for a little bit more detail on the event in just a second. But before I jump topics too much, and because Ralph used the name Team Southampton, I just invented with a very long question. Ralph, I don't know if you're in a position to unmute if you want to ask your slightly longer question. Are you able to ask that, or shall I read it out?
Yes, I can see. So my question, what was more striking, I think, in your results was, of course, this huge difference in performance between the online and in-person exams results. And whereas the differences in the online tests were, yes, they were there as you described, but just not quite striking. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts is of how you explain this.
Yeah, thank you, Ralph, for the question. I was actually trying to attempt to answer, but the answer was becoming too long. So I much appreciate to be able to answer. Yeah, it's difficult. So at the moment, of course, we haven't done much. We can't say. So it's just really our thought regarding this. I really think is a combination, and about our feelings. I don't know, in other universities that we felt that with online assessment, students did better than the previous period where they were doing exams. So there is possibly a combination of reason. Then being a first year module in particular, so students they hadn't been exposed to exams in the previous academic history. So I think the stress and the lack of maybe limited skill on doing an exams also played a role. Sorry, it's not one of them. I think it's at the end is possibly a combination, but we can't exclude some collusion, I'm afraid.
Have you thought about open book in-person exams? That wasn't your case, right? It was closed book.
It was closed book, but in fact, this would be a possible next step to consider, because in fact, asking students, they kind of they don't like the online long 1 day exam, even if 8 hours seems a lot, because they actually end up working for 8 hours, even if you tell them it's 2 hours. And many, in fact, suggested you like to be in the room. Ideally, they would like to be in a room with a computer and do the 2-hour assessment. So it's something to explore. Maybe works better with some assessment than in others, but why not? The maths can be also, depending on the question, can be one when it can be implemented. I don't know if Panos and Daniel have any other comment on this?
I think I am covered with what you said. I agree.
Yeah, I agree with Emanuela. It's a combination of the three. And I guess, the assessment methods depends on what your end goal is. And while, say, for the second and the third years, it does make sense to use various techniques and, get them group projects, essays and whatnot. We found out that, well, we haven't formally assessed this, but from teaching second and third years, I've noticed that when they had online assessments in the first year, then when they went into their second year, they didn't have as much grounding in the knowledge from the first year as they would have if they were actually required to engage with the content via an in-person closed book exam. Because, if it's an open book, then the incentive to actually memorize the formulas isn't there. And while, yes, you don't need to memorize things with Google nowadays, you do still need to get the understanding. And I think the main way to get students to do it is by, at least initially, making them memorize a few things so that they really get it in their head.
Thank you. Okay, Caroline, it's okay. I'm going to turn to you. Can you give us a bit more? I think this is always the really fun bit, if you can get your course to have some real authentic, reaching out to the community. Could you give us some kind of idea of sort of the questions and problems that students were working on?
Sure. So we've had a few different community partners who will kind of have an overarching question. So recently, for example, for the Center for Indian Country Development, they were really interested in looking at American Indian, Alaskan Native labor market outcomes versus other groups. So we sort of teased out some research questions for the students to work on, and they could pick a little bit too, which are the questions they were interested in, like gender and racial segregation and occupations, or income inequality for different income sources, or things like that, to try to look at those disparities from a few different angles and help a community partner think about areas for further research and policy action too. We like to try to think about, okay, here's what you found from your statistics. What does it mean in terms of policy response for the community partners potentially? So I think that's certainly an angle in terms of the research questions. And that's something we'll try to put some examples to as we get these teaching and learning materials ready by the end of the summer as well.
I just sort of follow up on that. Do you deliberately look to work with community partners and choose questions which ask like really interesting economics questions, which maybe don't reinforce typical economic stereotypes of it's all about money and finance? Is that a deliberate action on your part?
I think in general, a department tries to overcome some of those stereotypes of what economics is in all our classes, including our quantitative impact evaluation class and working with community partners. Even before we did the data fest, some of the community partners we worked with for the class in pre-COVID times, we were looking at things like, homelessness and some of those, the sort of, we think of big data tackling social issues being very engaging for students. And also, as a number of people have pointed out in the chat, students seem to really be connecting with and then getting jobs with these applied econometric skills. So we aren't emphasizing particularly theory or any of those theoretical aspects, but they do apply a difference in difference model and try to interpret it correctly, right? So they're building those skills, but very much from a perspective of seeing the value, I think, of those skills immediately to the community partner, and then maybe long-term, as folks have been pointing out, for applied jobs as well.
And just because you mentioned the technical skills there, and I think you said in your presentation that some of these students are econ majors and some of them aren't. Is there any element of the Data Fest event where you're teaching them to use RN's data, or is it something they have to teach each other?
There's a little bit of each. So we definitely introduce a few key, like in the first event, it's a little more summary statistics. And so we say, like, here are some of the commands. We do a few examples and we walk through the data set, because they're usually using the same data set. For example, we use the ones from IPMs that are publicly available oftentimes and have students download those. So we walk through a few commands and examples all together at the start, and they have that document and they have that handout to work with. And then in the small groups, we really try to message that you're helping each other do the coding. So they'll sit in small groups and people will be, maybe one person will be doing a t-test on this, one on something else, and they'll help each other as they get errors, or they'll all work in a group with a big screen together, depending on how they like to do their setup. We have some different spaces for that. So they can all be looking at the same data output and be sort of coding together and helping each other. And some will know some commands and some will know other commands, and they'll help each other kind of learn and build those skills. And so there's a lot of students who learn a lot, and because they're different skills you can use and build, you'll learn new commands from each other, even if you've already done DataFest before, because it's a little bit of a different question each time.
And just before I come back to Adeel and for Farid, if you're both still here, I think probably one of the first questions that hit me, Caroline, I'm sure it appears to have struck others. How much work does this take to set up? How much of it do you feel is credited? Is it, is it a well-resourced thing, or are there lots of people donating time to this? How does the kind of the logistics of all the organization and running the event work?
Sure. Did you want me to start with that?
Yeah.
And then other folks can. So in terms of, I saw a couple questions in the chat too. So we do have a little bit of different grant pots that we've been able to tap for a little bit of resources to like pay for the t-shirts and pay for dinner for the students, which has been helpful. So there may be different institutional funds. We've actually used, I think, different ones each year to pull together a little pot of money for that. Faculty haven't necessarily been compensated, but it is one of the assignments for some of the classes. So it's sort of built in to the assignments for the class, and then you sort of have one less thing that's very long to grade, but they still are doing the presentation and get credit for doing that in the DataFest event. So we've sometimes been able to do, this past year we had a little more funding for faculty honoraria too, but not necessarily being able to compensate. We try to build it in at a time that it works for faculty and students, like Friday afternoons, because we don't have usually Friday afternoon classes. So that's been relatively successful, but it's certainly particularly Christine, who's usually the one organizing this, and some of the student workers who help with it, it certainly is some time and effort. But we think it pays off in terms of student excitement and learning.
Fantastic. Brian, who's your question?
Well, actually, Annika, if people have questions for Team Southampton or everybody else, go ahead. My question is, I can email Christine and Caroline as well, so it's not, if other people have
that's all right.
No. I mean, as I said,
ask it, then I'll organize it.
Okay, so I guess my question for Caroline is, obviously teaching in the States as well. Is there a possibility of actually trying to look for NSF money in terms of finding a hook? And not that NSF want low income, not low income, but NSF experience is sort of like, okay, show us an audience that you could reach. And obviously, I think in terms of funding, you have access to a bigger pot. I realize it's not that simple as saying, hey, NSF, give us the money, but based on experience, they're looking at keywords, whether it's gender or income income differences, and you've already have tangible results. And as I said, that was just more, I guess that wasn't really more of a question, more of a, is that even possible? Because as I said, as other people have said in the chat, there's great job opportunities, network opportunities, empowerment, quantitative literacy. So I will stop and let you jump in.
If you give us a quick answer, Caroline, and then
yeah, I'll go super quick. Yes, we're very interested in that. We currently have an NSF grant looking at relevance, belonging, growth mindset across institutions. And when that one wraps up, I think the thing we want to do kind of next in this space is to think about DataFest, either scaling it up at other institutions and maybe actually doing a randomized controlled trial, or scaling it up with high schools. There are a couple other directions we're thinking about. A number of people have asked about this. So that's where we're headed. And I think this may be evidence that goes into a grant application down the line. If anyone's interested in collaborating or being an institution that hosts a DataFest at a high school or college level, do email us. This is not going to happen right away, but we'll save those emails. Thank you.
Awesome. Adeel and Farid, actually one of the first sets of questions that was asked earlier, can you tell us a little bit more about the students who took part in the course and whether there was any sort of self-selection or sort of systematic differences between the two groups? that you observed?
Adeel is probably better placed to answer this.
No. So there really wasn't, because these are all core courses, and it's like we mostly our students are clamoring to take these courses. It's not like there's not much chance of self-selection. So it's mostly randomized across the 2 cohorts. Yeah.
That's good to know. And then I'm going to, sorry.
Probably, I mean, we're going to continue the study next semester as well, so they're not going to be able to escape. So it's kind of like completely covers the cohorts.
A sort of follow-up question. I'll start with you guys, but then maybe ask everybody else from Team Southampton and Caroline as well. Have you been able to sort of observe anything about engagement beyond the study itself? So have you noticed any other effects in terms of sort of attendance or engagement in other online activities, or submitting homework or extracurricular kind of stuff across students who've taken part or as a result of the intervention? That's a very general question because it's to all of you, but Adeel and Farid, I'll give you, this will be the final question, by the way. I'll give you the first chance to answer. Have you noticed any knock-on effects of engagement or otherwise for the students?
Not in particular. I mean, because I was not at LUMS when I taught most of the COVID cohorts. For me, my personal experience was that it sort of went back to the way it was. My observation was that they were less prepared than they would have been if they had no COVID. But in terms of engagement, I didn't feel that they were less engaged than this cohorts which would have been face to face. But this may be very specific to where I was and what my context was. It doesn't have to be a general thing that everyone else observed, and so certainly Douglas and others didn't observe that.
Thank you. Team Southampton, same question to you. In changing assessment styles and everything, did you notice any sort of knock-on effects in other areas of their studies? So Panos, Emanuela, or Daniel?
Sorry, I was answering a question and I didn't think this question. Daniel, if...
I mean, part of it goes back to what I said to an earlier question, that the decision between online and on campus can have an impact of whether how much the students actually memorize the content, which for foundation modules, say like maths, stats, when we had the online exams, which didn't require them to actually memorize the content, when they went to the second and third year, then they didn't have sort of the background knowledge and they were struggling a bit more in the modules further down the road. Now, obviously, this was post-COVID, so we can't attribute that just to the change to online, and it could be partially because they started from a lower benchmark before even A levels, and then we're trying to bring them up. But it'd be one of those things to consider, whether there's a difference between the online and in-person exams in terms of how much they actually learn.
And finally, Caroline, same sort of question. Do you notice any sort of knock-on effects in engagement elsewhere as a result of taking part?
Yes.
Or as a result of the students taking part, sorry.
Yeah, participating. I think one of the things, so it was very hard, the online year, right? Trying to help people with data, online is just, it's very difficult format wise. I think people would be working in their own homes and get frustrated with coding. So I think the Data Fest event was great because it brought students together and with faculty and with some time to really help each other. And so I think that improved engagement. And that's one of the reasons we retained it even when we went back to in-person, is because we really try to message, if you're doing homework in your own room and you get a state of error message, it's frustrating. But if you're learning and practicing these skills in a group with faculty running around to help and other students there to help each other, I think we saw student skills kind of confidence and skills improve just from the additional practice of Data Fest. So it has helped, I think, students who then go on to research assistantships. They do then take more classes that use data skills. We think, they've talked about Data Fest as inspiring them to take econometrics in the fall, an additional course or something like that. So anecdotally, but that's a good thing to also possibly research, is to see you know, if we can scale this up and get a good identification strategy, do you actually have differences in retention in taking more econometrics courses in those sorts of things from this kind of model? So I'd be very interested to see.
Thank you. And
Annika, just
5 seconds, Panos.
1 second, yeah. So basically, in the first year of the pandemic, I was trying to find a method of engaging students with the materials taught in an online environment. And I was thinking that weekly quizzes will be a good method of engagement. And from the results, we saw that it was. Students were engaging. They were trying to understand, first to read the materials taught, and then answer the quizzes. And then me and Daniel, we said we can keep this arrangement in a more summative format, and it seems that students are engaging more with that, and they're performing better when they're engaging with online tests. So
good. And a very positive note to end on, I think. But there's hope out there. Thank you. I'm going to pick up on Brian's comment, talking about this as the CTaLE of economics teaching. That sounds great. I've never been. I'm going to assume for UK folks, it's also like Glastonbury. So I will say that next up on the pyramid stage is continuing with this conversation, actually, what happens to students next? So a plenary session on preparing economics students for life after graduation. I think we'll pause here so everyone gets time for a comfort break before that session, but we hope to see as many of you there as possible. Lots of good themes that we can continue here, so please do put that onto the discussion board and carry on the discussion there for anyone who's interested. A final thank you to Adeel and Farid, and to Panos, and to Emanuela, and to Daniel, and to Catherine for all your presentations and thoughts. I look forward to continuing chatting with everyone in those upcoming sessions. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you very much.